Okay, good afternoon, folks. We are back with H92, an act relating to Human Services Board fair hearing proceedings. And we have with us Michael Donahue, the chair of the Human Services Board. I think we'll do just a quick round of introductions so that you know who you're speaking with. I'm Teresa Wood. I'm chair of the committee, and I live in Waterbury, and I also serve Fulton, Buellscore, and Huntington.
Representative Van Donahue, Northfield and Berlin.
Good afternoon, Dan Noyes. I represent Woolpit, Hyde Park, Johnson, and Belvedere.
Hi, good afternoon. Eric McGuire, represent Rutland City.
Oh, I'm still on. Whoop. I was listening on my way up. Sorry. Hey, Brenda Steady, East Milton, Westford.
Doug Bishop, Colchester's Chittenden 20 District.
I'm Zahn Eastis. I represent Guilford and Vernon.
I'm Rep. Esme Cole of Hartford.
I am Jubilee McGill and I represent Bridgeport, Middlebury, New Haven, and Weybridge.
Hello, I'm Ray Garofano. I live in Essex and I also represent Essex Junction.
Florida Works Committee Assistant.
You know Joe. Okay, welcome, Mr. Donahue. We appreciate you being here. As you probably know by now, we have a short form bill on the wall addressing the Human Services Board, and it came about as a result of a legislator who's not on our committee, but brought that as a result of the experience one of his constituents had with the process. And so when we took a look at this, we realized that, really the legislation for the Human Services Board has not had any kind of thorough review in many, many years. And so we thought, because of the extensive use of the Human Services Board as part of the Agency of Human Services, that we should take a look at it, see if there's any need to make some changes. And I think that's probably particularly true in light of some of the changes that we anticipate coming down from the federal government and what that might mean for Vermont and for Vermonters who receive services from the agency. So we appreciate you being here. And the floor is yours to give us your thoughts about the Human Services Board, your role in it, how the board functions and the like. And then I'm sure we will have some questions as well.
Well, thank you. I thank the chair, Ms. Wood, and the vice chair, Ms. Garofano, and the ranking member, Ms. Donahue, and all the members for asking me here today. I don't have any particular written comments when I received this. And I understand how this goes. Things move quickly, especially as you're getting to this stage of the session. My understanding was that you're considering legislation that will look to enhance or reform the authorizing language for the board, and that my experience or questions I can answer about how the board functions and what we do could be useful to you as you consider what to do with the legislation. I am familiar somewhat with Representative McFaughn's case. I recall the case. I think that's the one you're referring was a case involving a constituent of Tupper McFaughn's, and I went back and looked at my notes. I keep some brief notes on the cover letter, not the original documents. And I do recall some basics of it. No, as you understand, it's my understanding, we're not to talk, in too much of a granular way about the individuals in these cases. But I think I'm happy to answer any questions about how we do what we do and the process that we use, and perhaps to comment on some of the concerns that you feel you're trying to address with your legislation. I have been on the board, I believe, since late 2018. I was first appointed. And I believe the governor appointed me chair subsequently early in 2019. And I recall, having to go through a confirmation process for that in the Senate, and I interviewed with Senator Hardy. And in the time since, periodically I will talk with folks as requested, at the agency. I know that we send an annual report, I believe, that our professional staff prepares, which I review, although I do not draft it, but I do review it, just give stylistic suggestions and so forth. We have had a pretty stable membership of the board, some longstanding members who have been on from previous administrations. We have a variety of folks on the board, some who have experience with nonprofits, others, we have a former legislator, I believe at least one. And we also have some lawyers, I think, who specifically worked for human services at some point or another. We have hearing officers, a chief hearing officer and two assistant hearing officers, lawyers, who do, as we say, de novo hearings into each case as it is appealed. And that, that's been a bit of a challenge, particularly through COVID and after, but even putting COVID aside, just hiring, obviously we have a high standard of quality for the lawyers and the folks that they're looking to hire for the board to be the hearing officers. And it's been difficult at times, that we've been short-staffed there for a couple of periods where there were only two lawyers, and they were trying to fill it, and it took a while. And this was also then but it was urgent, because we were then getting into the period of the wind down of the states of emergency for the state and the federal government, the wind down of ARPA funds and such. So that's kind of that's the basic outline of it. When I originally started with the board met once a month in Barre, and on a Wednesday. It was usually the first Wednesday of the month. During COVID, obviously, we all went to remote hearings, which after the emergency ended, I guess in 2022, and as the year went on, after discussions with the members and with the staff, and hearing also experiences with some of the other state boards, I serve on another one as well. We have thus far elected to do them remotely, although we have moved to twice a month now. So it's usually the first Wednesday and the third Wednesday of the month that we'll do hearings for those who wish to be present and speak to us, and also just to consider all of the cases that we have to consider the recommendation of the hearing officer. I think that's about the gist of it in terms of a broad outline. Is that sufficient, or is there something specific you'd like me to address, or go to questions? However you'd like to proceed, I'm happy to.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So I'm sure that we'll have questions. I think that's a sort of a good sort of basic understanding of how the board functions. One of the things that I'm curious about, so Mr. Reinert had talked to us about the process that they use as hearing officers, and then the presentation of their findings. So do you often find that the person who is appealed, do they usually come before the full board, or do you request that they do, or is that just an option? Are you usually only hearing the recommendations from the findings and recommendations from the hearing officer, or do you take other things into consideration, I guess is one of my questions.
Sure. As a rule, all petitioners are provided the opportunity to come before the board to make the case that they'd like to make or respond to the recommendation of the hearing officer that we've gotten after the hearings that the individual de novo hearings that take place with the professional staff. I would say, and I don't have exact stats on this, but certainly fewer than half of the petitioners elect to come before the board to specifically make their case. And it's for a variety of reasons. Some agree with, the recommendation of the hearing officer, and others elect not to pursue it any farther. But we do get a number of cases, a not insignificant number of cases that we take and hear individually. And then at the end of that, after we've heard all of those cases for a given day, the ones that are on the agenda, but no, the petitioner or the agency, the AAG representing the agency in the particular type of case, after if they haven't elected to speak on a particular case, we consider those sometimes individually or sometimes in an omnibus motion if we have several and we know we have a sense of where the board is on them. I guess one thing I would clarify, I know that you all know this, but maybe just to establish it, for those who might be viewing this or will view this. So it has been the practice of the board the entire time that I've been on, and I discussed this when I became chair with the staff, to ask the hearing officers to make a recommendation based on the hearings with the parties that they have done. I asked, and it was my sense, and I confirmed that with them, that we could say, don't make a recommendation, just write us a memo outlining the particulars of the case as you've heard them, both sides, and leave it to us. But we have, I certainly felt it was sensible. I saw no reason to change the practice of the board, and none of the members thought otherwise either. So we do ask them to give us a recommendation, which we consider. We don't always, I would say in a majority of the cases, we'll agree with the recommendation of the hearing officer. And so, for instance, when we go into executive session, the motion is someone will ask if there are motions, and it's a motion to accept the recommendation of the hearing officer. That's the motion. Although we have had cases where a motion is made to, someone will make the motion and it's rejected. That's happened recently, and we have to go back and then we have other cases where we might for instance, if we were to overturn a decision of the agency, it may come back to us, and in some cases, the secretary can overturn it by the authority that the secretary has. I thought that would be helpful, just a sense of how we do the business there. So we'll get a packet when we met in person, and now still, we'll get a very large packet with a memo for every case that's on the docket of the agenda.
And so, can you describe, I guess, in the situation like where maybe you heard information that might not have come out during the hearing that the hearing officer conducted, if somebody elects to come to the Human Services Board directly, and you feel like maybe you don't want to accept or reject, but you want to send it back to the hearing officer for additional consideration of details, or maybe additional information and verification or things like that. Do you have the ability to do that, or
Yes.
You do? Okay, and is that something that you have done?
Yes. So we'll sometimes the board will decide to remand a case, not make a final determination, act on the recommendation of the hearing officer, but to remand it back to either the hearing officer with more specific guidance. And we have had this happen. It's not common, but it does happen, where we say, no, we don't agree with the recommendation, and in fact, we know we want the opposite to be heard. And then we work with them and they work with us to develop, a formal legal memo because they're trying, they're doing their best to do work that's a legal process that can be used by the plaintiff or the agency so they can either respond to it, in fact, or appeal it if they wanted to go for it. So they're doing, they're well-trained lawyers and very conscientious. And so they're trying to do everything as, dot every I and cross every T as they can. And oftentimes that will come out where we'll say, oh, we want to do this. And they'll say, well, all right, we need to say what the legal rationale for that is. And we go back and forth. In some cases, we will remand it back to the agency and say, look, we don't agree with this. They obviously that's not their preferred course of action for us to do. But there are cases where there'll be some back and forth and they might say, we won't, they basically don't contest a decision that we've made, even though that it was against them. In other cases, they will come back strongly and say no. And it's those cases usually involve, and this is obviously a key thing for our board, those cases where they come back and they push back, and we just recently had one where the secretary overturned a decision that we made. It's usually on the grounds that they will argue that we don't have the authority to do what we are saying, or we have misconstrued the hearing as expressed through the hearing officer. We've misconstrued the issue at hand. And I do understand that, we're not a tribunal in the sense where we're trying to establish this is what should happen regardless of the process. We're trying to, we do have to, to the best of our ability, make sure we're acting within what our remit is to say, is the agency, with respect to a decision they make on a given program, acting appropriately within their powers and their powers to set up their own rules, whether in conjunction with a federal program like Medicaid or individually as a state program. And sometimes that's in contention, where we say, obviously that's a very specific thing. If we say, we don't think that you're acting appropriately within the scope of your powers. There are cases that develop that way. One of them, just as an example, I'm not talking about a specific case, but generally speaking, the Katie Beckett waiver and Medicaid program. There's a scope to that program, a history to that program. It's a federally developed waiver within the Medicaid system. But then there are questions of to what extent, given what we know the federal parameters are, what is the state's ability to limit the scope of the program, that sort of thing.
Thank you. Questions from members? Okay, I have another one. If you have a situation where a department has several appeals that have come before the board on essentially the same topic, and I'm going to use reasonable accommodation as one following the ADA as something that we can use as an example. So let's just say that.
I apologize just for a moment, if I could clarify. So you're not saying a specific case that's coming, because we do have people in the same case that sometimes will come back before. You're talking about a type of case that we.
Yeah, I'm just talking about a type of case, right? And I'm more wondering. So if the hearing officer has recommended and the board has agreed with the recommendation and the secretary has not overturned it, if the secretary has that authority in certain cases, and so multiple times. The board may have found that it doesn't matter what department, but a department has not followed the ability to provide reasonable accommodation according to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so on multiple occasions that they've done that, and you've found in the appellant's case each time they then turn around and implement whatever it is that you've decided. Do you make any sort of like non-case specific, but do you say to the board, like, okay, we've now received, 6 different complaints, all of the same type, all from your department, all around the same issue. Maybe you should be looking at how you are implementing, whatever decision it is that you're making. Do you make those kind of policy or I guess I would call them recommendations back to the department or to the secretary with regard to a department's actions?
Your question's well taken, and there is no one set and established way to do that for us. But that kind of occurrence does take place in some of the cases we do, and board members attempt to provide that sort of guidance in different ways. So often with a case, board members will propose, I'll put the motion out there and we'll pass it, where we ask that a footnote or a clarification or even a question is posed within a decision where we've voted to, say, uphold or oppose even, I suppose, a particular, we've ruled in favor of the petitioner or not, but we'll say, you know what, it might be helpful to clarify this for people who are using said program because we're noticing that this is an issue. Now, some of these are kind of perennial issues that are not unique to us, and I don't think there's any, we'll often, a perennial thing that we hear about, for instance, is, and it gets into a legal question because some of the lawyers who will come before us with advocacy groups will talk about whether the simple act of, which has been established, but I understand given between COVID and people's real and perceived concerns about the mail, they'll say just the fact that the agency has mailed something out, does that constitute a fact that they received it? And so sometimes we'll get into this back and forth where someone will say they didn't receive something and the agency will say, well, it was sent out, we don't have an answer for something like that. But we do sometimes raise these points that we're seeing a lot of them. Like another one, for instance, has to do with getting health insurance, on the exchange in the open market. One of the things we've noticed is some of the calls are not recorded. So when we're dealing with the facts of a case, when they're talking to, in many instances, when they're talking to direct Vermont state employees, calls are being recorded. But sometimes when you're dealing with third-party, like payments processors or others, those are not recorded. And then we run into an issue where, well, there's no recording of this that we can refer to. We hear a lot, for instance, about how the tax credits that can help individuals or families to pay for insurance on the market based on income. It's a bad design. It's a federal design pushed on the state, and so we frequently run into folks who are asking for the state to reimburse them for money that they feel that they're owed, and in fact would be owed ultimately based on income, because their income fluctuated throughout the year, and it's very imprecise then how the tax credit is applied. And the only answer that we can give them is to say, well, you can work that out when you file your federal taxes. That's obviously a very frustrating thing for individuals in that market to have to deal with, because they're basically being told, well, you can sort it out when you file your taxes. But on the other hand, it's not in the state's control, and we certainly can't say, oh, well, the state should float that money in the intermediate period, and then it's the state's obligation to recover it. You know, we run into those kinds of questions. On the general topic of this sort of thing, where the board has you know, thoughts about, you know, we've seen a lot of this, and what should we do? There's no, since I've been on the board, and I don't believe it's established in the law that there's any regular process. There's nothing restricting us from trying to find a way to express it, but there's no process where we say, you know, here's what we found, and we think, you know, might want to take a look at this. Now, at times, you know, on occasion, not commonly, you know, I or sometimes a member might raise something with someone in the agency. There's been a few times where I was asked to speak with counsel over there, particularly when we were going into and out of COVID, about you know, we were going to see an uptick in cases, and then we were going to see an uptick in cases as we were winding down. You know, occasionally somebody a board member will say, we've had this kind of conversation, we should write a letter to the, you know, to the legislature or something like that. And, you know, I always want all of the board members to feel heard, and we discuss these things. But I'm always a little wary of that, you know, regardless of party. I mean, do you want us, you know, the Human Services Board start sending out letters to the legislature, or to you, for instance, or whatnot? And obviously you call us before, and we're happy to answer questions. But if we start sending out letters, you know, as I've told them, it's like we're sending out a press release, you know, so.
Well, Mr. I was just going to say, that's an excellent segue to my next question or my next comment. So, you know, we are likely to take up some potential changes to the statute. And so, honestly, if there are potential areas that you feel like need clarification, or that you would like to suggest potential alternate language, especially in the enabling legislation, then I would, you know, urge you, maybe, you know, through your hearing officers, to be in contact with us over the next week if there are specific things that you'd like to see. If there are not, and you think everything is hunky-dory the way it is, it's also helpful to hear that. This is, as I said in my opening comments, that there hasn't been sort of a baseline review of the statute that governs the creation and operation of the Human Services Board for many years. And so that while there have been, you know, additions to your responsibilities every time the state, you know, adds a new program, you get to be the folks who be the, you know, arbiters of whether a decision is made appropriately or not. There really hasn't been sort of this look at, is the basic underlying statute, you know, does that need any modifications? So we'd, you know, appreciate knowing from, you know, you folks, because you're the ones who experience it every day and every month, whether you feel like there are things that would be helpful to you in carrying out your duties. And, you know, we're going to hear from the Secretary's office this week as well, and going to hear from people who have experienced the Human Services Board. So, you know, hopefully over the next week or so, we'll be taking a look at some potential draft language. So I encourage you to stay engaged with the process. I'm sure that you will. And like I said, we'd appreciate any comments or suggestions that you might have to the underlying statute.
Yes, and I know Joe Reinert, who's I know you all know, is our chief hearing officer. And I think he might. I almost think
He's here.
there.
He's here.
Oh, he is.
He's
Okay.
still here. Yes.
I didn't want to say, "Oh, look, there's Joe," but then it's
Yeah.
I know he's been looking closely at it, and we've had some preliminary discussions, and you know, it's something we have a meeting tomorrow of the board, and obviously I'm going to apprise them of this hearing, and you know, we'll talk a little bit about it. You know, as board members, like I said, as I said earlier, it's a diverse group politically, by Vermont standards, and with a wide variety of experience. And I would be comfortable. It's obviously your prerogative to take a look at this board and the process and say, how can we make this work better? I would say try to make both for efficiency and as well for what's best for the petitioners. It's an interesting board. You've got now that there's several lawyers on there, former lawmakers, people who versed in policy, but nevertheless, they're these are volunteer positions, and we're considering this. So we're very mindful that we're trying to do our due diligence for the petitioners, for whom the entire process of dealing with the issues they're grappling with, and then the process of dealing with government can be disconcerting and wear you down. But at the same time, we're mindful of trying to do what's best for the taxpayer and the professionals who work over in the agency, and trying to balance that all together. I think it could be beneficial to have a process, an established, clear process, where perhaps there was a way for us to provide feedback other than our votes on each case, maybe a periodic check-in with the relevant committee, in this case yours, where we come in once a session, or we establish a communication process there where it's a check-in. Obviously sounds reasonable to me. There are some things, short of enlarging Joe's cadre of hearing officers, and obviously that would take resources. I think there are limitations to what can be done. Very often, and I mention this because I know that this has come up, and every board member has thought of this. There are moments when there will be petitioners on, and we think, and I just want to again say, we have fantastic hearing officers. They're very diligent and conscientious, and they're really, they have a great sense of the whole mission of what they're trying to do. Nevertheless, you've got some folks coming before, they don't have any counsel with them, and that I've no doubt that can be intimidating. And on top of that, some of the significant number of the folks that are coming before the board clearly have, there could be mental health, addiction issues. I mean, we've had some repeat folks who come on appealing a variety of rulings, some of whom actually are somewhat belligerent, and they'll berate the hearing officers, and then they'll berate us, accusations of everything you can think of. The board members are drug users, board members are mentalists and controlling their minds. We had one who told us, that they were trying to mail information that was vital to the case, and the governor had attacked her on the way to the mailbox. There are many times when we come away from the meetings and it's sad. It's necessary work, we understand. And I think it's to the credit, all the members on the board who've been there a long while. As chair, I was honored to do it and happy to do it. Sometimes it seems rough, but it's important. We always try to be a receptive, even kind face for the petitioners when they come, because they're all, they're very frustrated. Even just a typical, we'll have like a small business owner who has who is a sole proprietor, maybe runs a construction business. And then, you've got awful increases in life insurance, health insurance rates. And so they go in the open market, and then you get into the screwy thing that goes on with what credits they get and what credits they don't get. And, and we're telling them, oh, but the state can't just give you $2,000. You have to do that they're running payroll, they have staff. They're frustrated. They're very frustrated. That's not something we can fix. And actually, I don't even know what we could tell you that you could fix it. I mean, that's like another thing altogether. But those are the kinds of things we deal with. And that doesn't even touch on the cases we deal with, findings of abuse and people being put on lists. There's a really broad, there's a really broad number of cases and types of cases that we deal with. And as you say, things get added. For a while there, we were being braced to deal with cases involving migrants and making sure that their rights were being adhered to with regard to questions involving benefits. And I remember thinking when we were being told of this, and that it made sense, I guess, that it would come to us, but it was just kind of like, oh, we'll send it to the Human Services Board, it's kind of a catch-all. And I believe, Human Services, the agency, is probably the largest agency in the government. So
It is. Yep.
it's kind of a lot of stuff that could come before us.
It does. It does. Well, thank you very much for being here this afternoon, Mr. Donahue, and thank you for your service on the Human Services Board. I, as you just said, the breadth of what AHS has in terms of all of the services, supports, programs, federal, state, all of the above, is pretty daunting. And so, appreciate the fact that you have a wide variety of things that come before you. And so if there are, excuse me. Excuse me. If there are things that, as I said, things that you think that could be helpful in the underlying statute, please let us know. And in the meantime, we again appreciate your service and that of your board. And
may I make one just brief point? There was something I did want to mention.
Sure.
And I apologize. So, and that was the fact that we're doing, I know I mentioned that we do our hearings remotely. And this is something we've discussed, are there folks who might feel, we occasionally hear things that people will say, we've had advocates who will say, that there's a variety of concerns that will be expressed. We've had individuals, advocacy groups will say, well, our folks feel intimidated coming before your board. We'd like to do it. We feel that we should be able to do it for them. But there are questions about, if they're not immediately party to the case, does that work for our hearing officers who are trying to write documents of a legal character, of someone who actually witnessed or knows occurrences that have happened firsthand. And we don't, I don't know what we would do with that, how exactly we would handle that. All we can say is you can come before the board virtually or you can come in person. Now, which gets me to the other point about meeting virtually. Some folks, I would say doing the hearings virtually has actually, I think, it enabled more people than not to appear before the board. Now, is there a subset who do not like that and would insist on seeing us in person? It's quite possible. And what I've always told the hearing officers is that if we had an instance where someone wanted to see the board, we would set up a policy where at least one board member, the chair at least, would come down and we could do it in person and the other members would appear virtually. As I've seen with other, I said around VEPSI, we have some members who appear virtually, some in person. It's a mix depending on what's necessary to get a quorum. We would lose, there are some members of our board who who live in Bennington and other places who probably wouldn't stay on the board if every meeting was in person. But I'm certainly agreeable to, as the chair, I would feel, an obligation to try to work that out. Like, so if I needed to get done, I live in Shelburne, if I needed to get down to Montpelier or Barry, if that's where we did it, then I would do that. We could do kind of a hybrid thing. We're not opposed to that. We're not just set, I'm just a little reticent, concerned that some folks might think, that some of the members just of the board like doing it remotely because it's, easier that way. It has been our sense, and we've asked that it's enhanced our ability to have petitioners come bring cases and be heard. Because there are a number who don't come, when I was present, a member of the board and chair when we were meeting, all meetings were in person before COVID. And, there were many of the cases where nobody came for a particular case. They sent it to the board and that was that. So, and, my guess is that the AAGs would also probably prefer it remotely since, they're very busy and they're all, I'm not saying that's the reason we should continue a certain way or not, but anyway, I'm starting to ramble a bit. Sorry about that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We appreciate you being here, and I'm sure that we'll be in touch as this bill winds its way through the process over the next couple of weeks. So thank you very much. And thank you, Joe, for being here as well.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you all.
All righty. Take care.
Bye.
Okay, folks, that's going to wrap it up for today. What do we have on tap for tomorrow? Oh, we're going to
Dansville.
Dansville, yeah,
Yeah.
Dansville, except we're on Zoom, so I think I'm not going to say that out loud. We're on YouTube, but Dan can share that after we get off YouTube. So we have S36, which is the Senate bill that was sent over to us, the real Senate bill that was sent over to us. And we will continue with H92. What I've done is to ask the assistant AGs from the various departments that interact the most with the Human Services Board to come, as well as Vermont Legal Aid. So, and we will be hearing from the Agency of Human Services, who says that they may have some suggestions for the underlying statute. So that's mostly what's on tap for tomorrow. And then, of course, the floor. Okay, Lori, I think we're done for today.